Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at biotic and abiotic factors for your GCSE biology. Now I know the difference between the two, biotic and abiotic, is very subtle, but it is a really important one and it can come up in lots of different areas. So get ready to make notes on this video, and if you're confused about anything, remember you can pause the video and rewind it and work at your own pace.
Hi everyone. Okay, so we're going to be looking at biotic and abiotic factors today and how they can affect the size of populations. So we're going to start with biotic factors. So biotic factors are living things. So living things, mostly organisms, that can affect the population growth or the population size of another organism. And normally it's to do with something about that organism that makes it affect the survival of the organisms in the population. So we talked about interdependence before, so that's kind of what we're talking about here, because we're talking about predators and prey and how they rely on each other for food, but also we're talking about other things that are living that can cause a decrease or an increase in the size of a population. So the examples of biotic factors that we need to know are predators, so the number of predators, or if there's any new predators that come into the area, pathogens or diseases. So pathogens are obviously viruses, bacteria, fungi, protists, all of those examples of pathogens, organisms, microorganisms that cause disease. And also I've put this idea of them being also spread by things like mosquitoes. So new pathogens, diseases in a population can affect whether they can survive, if they get sick. And then the amount of food. So the amount of food available in your habitat, whether it's lots or not a lot, can affect your population size. And lastly, competition. We're going to look at competition in the next slide because it needs to go into a bit more detail. But if you're competing with another organism for a resource, then that's a biotic factor. So the main biotic factors here is this idea of predators and prey, because they're both going to be very closely linked and they can affect each other in terms of population size in quite specific ways. So we show these predator-prey relationships often using graphs, and you need to be able to interpret these graphs and describe what's going on in the graph and how these two population sizes affect each other. So you'll see I've got my graph and I've got two sets of peaks here, one purple and one green, and the prey is in purple and the green represents a predator. Now you could substitute this for any animals, but I've just kept it as prey and predator for now. But you might get different examples in an exam question with actual different species on. So there's specific rules with these graphs than the way that they are drawn. So the predator line, you'll see my green line here, is always shifted to the right. So you'll see the peaks of my predator line are always to the right-hand side of my prey, because there's this delay in effect between the prey population and the predator population. And you'll also notice that the peaks of my predator lines are always below the peaks of my prey lines, and that's simply because there can never be more predators than prey, because if they completely ran out of food, they completely ate everything, then they wouldn't be able to survive. So we can't have more predators than prey, so the peaks have to be below every single time. So shifted to the right and below. Occasionally you could be asked to draw an extra line on a graph, but those are the rules. That's how you would sketch one of these graphs. So now we have to think about how we can describe and explain what's actually happening in this graph. Okay, so the first section we're looking at is that first increase. So when the prey population increases, so you can see that's the first line to increase. So when the prey population increases here, then there's more food available for the predators. So there's a slight delay, but then the predator population starts to increase because they can survive and reproduce more because there's more food. And now we look at what happens next. So now there's a decrease. So we have an increase in the prey population. Then we have an increase in the predator population because there's more food, so they reproduce more. But now our predator population has got quite high. Okay, so our predator population has got quite high. There's a lot of predators. So they actually end up eating too much prey because there's so many of them. They eat too much. We've shifted the balance one way, so there's now loads of predators. They eat too many prey. So that prey population decreases. And then with a delay, again, a slight delay of potentially a year or a few years, predator population has run out of food. There's a decrease in food because of the decrease in prey population. So they also start to decrease because not as many of them are surviving and reproducing because there's not enough food. And then lastly, we have our increase. So because the predator population has decreased, there's fewer predators. And so because there's fewer predators, suddenly the prey population starts to increase because more prey are going to be able to survive and reproduce because there's fewer predators eating them. And then we go back to how we were before. So that increase of prey restarts this cycle. So because there's more food, we get another increase in the predator population after a short delay. And this just goes up and down and up and down and up and repeats in cycles over years of time. But you can see how both of them are very closely linked to each other. So the amount of predators, the number of predators is greatly going to affect the population size of the prey. And equally, the population size of the prey can then affect the number of predators. And that's how they're linked together as two biotic factors that are very much entwined. As I said, we're going to talk about competition. Competition is a biotic factor. So competition arises because species of animals, populations of animals, communities are living in a similar environment. They're living in the same environment, whether it be the desert, a forest, a hedgerow, they're living in the same space. And so therefore they have to ultimately share the resources that are in that space. And the sharing of resources that are obviously limited, there's a finite amount of resources, causes competition. They're competing for the same resources, so they have to compete with each other to see who can get the most or who can get the best in order to survive. So there are a couple of examples of types of competition. There's two types. Competition either happens between species that are the same, so individuals in the same species, or individuals of different species, and we have two names for that. Interspecific competition is specifically referring to competition between two individuals of different species. Okay, interspecific, between species competition. So two individuals could be a tiger and a bear, could be two different species of fish, for example. They compete, it's interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is when the competition is happening between two individuals of the same species. So birds of the same species living in the same tree will compete with each other for food. Fish of the same species in the same river will compete with each other for food, and that's intraspecific competition. So I've mentioned some examples of competition. They're different for animals and plants. So we need to know the different examples of what animals compete for and what plants compete for. So animals compete for food, the main one, mates, so the right to mate with another organism or compete to try and reproduce with certain individuals in their population, and territory. So I've got my little coral reef here because we know things like, especially in crowded places like this, they'll have a specific coral they live in or a territory they live in, and they'll compete to have the best food sources around them or the best shelter. Plants also compete, obviously, with each other. So plants compete for things that they need in order to survive. So they compete for space. Rainforest here is a great example of space where there's not much space around. Everything's crowded on top of each other. You've got to try and grow up above each other to get to the light. And that's the second thing that plants compete for, is light. So they will climb up over each other or try and grow taller than another one to try and get more light. And then also water and mineral ions in the soil. I've shown my cactus here. We know that in places where water is limited, plants try and have to compete for it with neighbouring plants so they have bigger roots. And also minerals potentially as well, expanding their roots and getting as much water and minerals from the soil as they can. Competition, remember, although these things here, space, light and water, or potentially territory, are not living things, competition itself, remember, is a biotic factor because it involves living organisms. They're they're competing with another organism for space. They're competing with another organism for light, and that organism is alive. So that's why it's a biotic factor. Thinking about some of the examples I've got here, like my cactus, competition is a driver of adaptation. So the more you have to compete with another organism, the more likely it is organisms will develop specific mutations, which can lead to adaptations because they're more successful in that environment at competing for that thing, whether it's light, space, food, mates. And so it's a driver of adaptation through natural selection, because the organisms with the adaptations that help them compete better for that factor are going to be able to survive more, reproduce more, and pass on those characteristics. So over time, it can lead to evolution through natural selection. And we'll look at that in a separate video. Okay, so the other type of factor that we're going to look at is, or the other type of group of factors, is abiotic factors. Now, normally in science, if we put A in front of something, it means no, or missing, or gone. So non-biotic factors, basically, which means they're non-living. They're the opposite of biotic. They're going to be non-living things that can affect an organism's survival, and therefore they can affect population growth, population size. They're normally related to features of the habitat that the organism's living in. So I've got two habitats here. I've got a desert environment, and then I've got a very wintry, snowy, Arctic environment. So because of the nature of the habitat, the abiotic factors in the desert environment are going to be very different to the abiotic factors in the cold environment, because they are what make up the kind of habitat and the climate around where those organisms live. So when we say abiotic factors, it's usually to do with the habitat, the environment, the physical environment, the temperature, the weather. That's what we're talking about. So I'm going to go through some examples and think about how they can affect species. Okay, so our first example, and they're all related to the pictures at the bottom. So the first example is temperature. Now, the main factor that temperature controls is that it can affect enzyme-based reactions, enzyme-controlled reactions. So that's pretty much all living organisms could potentially be affected by temperature. It can also affect the water availability. So if we're thinking about something really hot and desert, it tends to also be dry. So if there's a high temperature, water evaporates faster, so therefore there's likely to be less water available. It affects transpiration. So plants losing water, they will be losing more water in hot environments because of, again, the rate of evaporation. And all of that can therefore affect plants and animals. Second abiotic factor is availability of water. I say availability because just saying water isn't quite enough. It's about how much water or moisture there is in the environment, how much is available to the organisms. Now, all plants and animals require water to survive. So this is just simply a big one. If it's very, very dry, there isn't any water, or they aren't able to find or get water, after a few days, most plants and animals will die. Light intensity, again, being specific with our language here, try not to just say light. You can say light availability potentially, but light intensity is really what we're going for here. So we know the sun rises and falls every day, but it's about how intense that light can be. So it obviously affects photosynthesis. The more light we have, the more photosynthesis the plants are able to do. So that will obviously affect plant growth and population size more. It also affects the temperature. If you've got a high light intensity, that goes hand in hand with high temperature, and therefore it can also affect water levels. High light intensity increases the temperature, increases evaporation, transpiration, and all those things we said for temperature as well. Thinking of animals and how they're affected, sunburn is a real issue. So exposure to UV rays and sunburn is something that can affect animals, and it can affect their survival. Looking at another one that specifically affects plants this time is the minerals in soil. So plants need essential nutrients for things like magnesium for making chlorophyll, sodium, all of those ions that they get from the soil, nitrogen in order to make DNA and amino acids. They need these minerals in the soil. If they're lacking or there's not enough of them, it can affect growth and therefore survival and therefore population size. And then lastly, something that's often a human impact, but not always, pollution of both water and soil. So anything where the soil or the water around where the organisms are living, if there's any chemicals, if there's too much salt, if there's a high or low pH of an extreme, all of these things can affect the survival of organisms living in or around the water and the soil. It can make them sick, it can make it hard for them to live unless they're very specifically adapted. Talking about specific adaptations, in the same way that we said about biotic factors can drive change and adaptation over time, abiotic factors can do the same thing, so they can also lead to adaptations over time and therefore evolution of different species, and they often result in what we call extremophiles. So extremophiles are organisms that have adapted, like incredibly adapted to very, very, very specific and usually very harsh environments. So environments that have extreme temperatures, extreme light intensities, extreme toxicity, so lots of salt, really low or really high pH. They've adapted to live there. So that's one way that abiotic factors or competition can drive evolutionary change. The final thing related to this topic is to be able to think about interpreting population growth when it's represented by a graph. So all populations change size all the time due to various responses to various factors, and some of those factors being limiting, so what we've said about lack of food or lack of space. The changes in a population to those resources or to those factors is very important, and we can use certain setups and experiments or models to show how most populations change over time. Most of them will follow the same pattern, which is what we call this sigmoid or S-shaped curve, which we'll look at in a minute, that can be broken up into various stages. And to do that, often we look at microorganisms, bacteria, single-celled organisms to do this, because they're easy to model, they replicate quickly, so you can see results fast rather than waiting for generations of an animal to reproduce. So in this example, we can use yeast, which is a single-celled microorganism, and we can contain it in what we call a closed system, so that we are controlling all of the factors, how much nutrients they get, how much space they have, whether or not we let the gases in and out, and that controlled environment, we can then watch how the population changes by monitoring how many organisms grow over time. So I've got an example of what it might look like here. So I've got a conical flask with yeast culture solution in it, which contains some nutrients for them to be able to grow. And we'd start off with a really small number of organisms we'd put in, and then we'd watch them multiply and divide over time. And we record the numbers by taking out small samples potentially, or using some form of technology to help determine how cloudy the liquid is, which should tell us the number of individuals. But the idea is, in this system, the resources are limited. There is only a set amount of food, nutrients in the broth, and they will run out eventually. And there's no escape for things like carbon dioxide or any other waste products. You can use this setup. You could specifically look at biotic or abiotic factors you wanted to change to see how it could affect the growth curve. So you could change the temperature, you could change the type of food or the amount of food you gave them. You could change the size of the conical flask to see how, if you gave them more space, what would happen. And then you could compare the results. But we're just going to look at this idea of having one fixed setup, and we're going to just see in general if we get that S-shaped curve. Okay, so when presented with a growth curve, we need to be able to identify the phases or stages of growth and talk about and explain why they are happening. What's happening there in terms of the number of organisms and the size of the population, and why is it happening? So the first stage is just called the lag phase. The population size is stable, it's the same number of organisms that we started with, and it doesn't change very rapidly because the organisms are probably adjusting to their environment. In this case, we've just set this up, but also because there's no immediate cell division or replication or reproduction, because they need to get used to where they are in their environment and also get enough nutrients on board and be stable before they can start doing reproduction. And now we move on to the exponential phase. So you can see I've got a really steep curve rising up now, and so that shows you there's a rapid increase in population size. So this rapid increase in population size is because a lot of reproduction is happening. We're dividing rapidly, we're reproducing rapidly, and that's because we've got a lot of nutrients. There's a lot of food, it's in excess, there's plenty of nutrients and food for everyone, and all of the yeast cells are able to happily grow and reproduce pretty quickly. And now we've moved into the stationary phase. Stationary meaning still. We've got a little bit of a plateau, a flat line happening. And that's because at this rate, we're not increasing our population anymore. It's pretty stable. It's staying and hovering around the same numbers. And that's because the amount of reproduction is being matched by the number of organisms that are dying. So the death rate and the reproduction rate are equal. We've still got enough food to keep reproducing, but some organisms now are dying and getting old, but we've got a stable population rate. And finally, we come to the death or the decline phase, which you can see now my population starts to rapidly decrease and drop off. So my numbers are declining or decreasing. And this is simply because we've run out of food or nutrients. The yeast have run out of food and nutrients. They've used it all up, so there isn't any more food, so they start to die. The organisms start to die. There is also an option here because we have got this set up in a closed system. So if you think about it, within my conical flask, what's going to happen is we're going to get a build-up of waste products. So if my yeast cells are growing and dividing, they're living organisms, so they're respiring. And so initially they will use up the oxygen. So when we say resources and food, that also in this case is going to include oxygen. Once they've used it up, they'll do anaerobic respiration, which is going to produce alcohol. So this builds up of carbon dioxide and alcohol is going to potentially create a really toxic environment that is going to cause them to die. So this death phase is not technically part of our S-shaped curve. So if you think about it, our S-shaped curve is this part. This is the S here, the sigmoid shape that goes from a lag phase up to our stationary phase. The death phase only really happens in a closed system, or if there's a massive change in the factors in the environment. So for this example, if we said they ran out of food, this would be what would happen, a decrease in population if their prey ran out, for example, or all of the trees that they need to eat suddenly died because of a disease. If there's that big change, then we can move into that death decline phase. And if you can think about it, this is what we saw in the predator-prey relationship, this peak and trough. So, however, when we talk about most populations in nature that's kind of not in a closed system that can fluctuate, they stay around here, around this stationary phase. So they increase in growth and normally they stay around that stable phase, unless they can fluctuate a bit up and down. They won't be perfectly the same numbers. But as we said, if everything's in balance, if the food chains are in balance, if the biotic and abiotic factors are stable, then the population number should stay around here, unless conditions drastically change. Okay, so now we're just going to summarise all the things that we've talked about so far in the video. So remembering that biotic factors are living things, they're living things that can cause or affect the survival of organisms and therefore affect the population growth. And the examples we looked at were food, or the amount of food, diseases or pathogens, especially new ones, and predators, especially new predators, and then finally competition. Focusing in on just competition here then, just a couple of things. So you've got interspecific and intraspecific competition, knowing the difference between the two, and knowing what things animals and plants compete for. So they're competing for the same resources, often in the same habitat. So for animals, that would be mates, territory and food. And for plants, that would be light, space, water, and then also mineral nutrients in the soil. The abiotic factors that we looked at, so remember abiotic means non-living, so it can't involve a living organism. And the options that we looked at were things like temperature, light intensity, availability of moisture or water, availability of mineral ions in the soil, and then things like pollution or some form of toxicity or chemicals in water and soil. We looked at predator-prey relationships, which are obviously related to the biotic factors because they're both, the idea of food and predators are both biotic factors. So remember, you can show them as this graph, and there's a couple of rules. Predator graph should always have peaks to the right or should be shifted to the right of the prey, and the peaks of the predator graph should always be lower than the peaks of the prey graph.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.